I'm talking to Dr. Alessandri, who is a philosopher and the author of Night Vision. Um, Dr. Alessandri, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you for being interested.
So I think a lot about how I start these conversations, these interviews. So I said, thank you for talking to me. It's sort of like a presumptuous thing to say. It's sort of like there's an expectation of like, the other person to respond, thank you. Sometimes I respond, I start, how are you doing today? And the presumption there is that they're going to say, I'm doing fine, which is not necessarily a good presumption to make, because people can come into a conversation like this, not necessarily doing great, or doing fine. And I feel like that's sort of a part of what your book is about, night vision.
Yeah, I mean, that's funny you say. I just did an Instagram post yesterday where I say, like, how about we just stop asking each other how we are? Or how about we save that for really special occasions when we have a lot of time? Because it just pressures a person into saying fine. Or you have to be the weirdo and be like, oh no, I'm not doing very well at all. And then it's like, wait, what? I'm not ready for this. And so I kind of have tried to like eradicate that phrase from my vocabulary unless I really have time for a complexity of a whole human being, because we're not ever just like fine or bad or whatever. Like we're probably often like a mix of things. And so I've started thinking of, alternatives like nice to see you, nice to meet you, like just something. And some people comment to me that like in other cultures, they just say hi, or they say nice to see you. Or in one culture, they say like I'm going west or I'm going east. And I love that because it's not pressure to describe yourself and your whole emotional state in a couple words. It's really just like, oh, I am glad to be sitting and talking with you. Like that's the truth of how I feel now. I don't know how in my emotional life, but like I'm glad to be able to have a chance to talk about my book. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. So the book is titled Night Vision, seeing ourselves through our dark moods. Is that right?
Yeah, that's it.
That's it. Yeah. So what is night vision? What are our dark moods?
All right. There's just a running metaphor in the book that there's light and there's dark, right? And so we say things like, I was enlightened, or can you lighten up, or um, bring your own sunshine, or look on the bright side, right? Like in our country, especially in the US, we're just full of these metaphors, and all of them I take to create this one thing that I call the light metaphor, which is every time we invoke the light to be the positive thing, the good thing. This is what you should be. And it goes along with all the phrases that you see if you walk into Target on the pillows and the posters that say, make today ridiculously amazing, choose happy, stay positive, good vibes only, no bad days, right? So it's just like this world of, for me, what feels like pressure to be bright and sunny and optimistic and great, and to have kind of chosen it, right? Like I made myself this way. And so there's the light metaphor. And it's great when things are going well. Like if you're having a really good day, you can be kind of fooled into thinking like, I made this a great day. I have my kids' principal says to them every single day, make it a great day or not, the choice is yours. So there's this idea that we choose our happiness, we choose our joy, we choose our good days, we choose our positivity, we choose our gratitude and all this. This is like the environment that I live in. So you can check it and your listeners can check it to see if that's also the environment they live in. But it has an underside, right? So the underbelly of the light metaphor is what I'm calling the brokenness story. Because, oh my God, do I have bad days? Like, I don't bring the sunshine where I go. Like, I just bring myself, and myself is sometimes sad, often anxious, and currently grieving, and full of dark moods. I'm kind of congenitally angry. Like, I'm just angry like every day. So the chapters of my book are about anger, sadness, grief, depression, and anxiety. And the question is, okay, well, if light is amazing, if all those bright moods are great and, self-caused, what am I supposed to think of myself when I'm sad, when I don't have a good day? Like if the standard is no bad days, and my kid's soccer coach like wears that shirt, hashtag no bad days. So it looks at me And already I feel terrible. Already I'm like, oh, I failed life because I had a bad day today, you know? So the underbelly of the light metaphor is the brokenness story where people like me, and I see it in my students, I teach university students, that all we have recourse to say about ourselves is that we're broken in some way. When we're not in those great moods, when we're in a dark place, when we're in a dark mood, when we're sad and anxious and depressed, then we don't have some nice metaphors. We just have like, oh, I'm broken or dysfunctional or mentally ill or diseased, or like I have a malady or an ailment, you know, I'm suffering with this thing. And so it just feels like it's a recipe for not feeling very good and not feeling whole and feeling broken. What I want is like night vision. I want to like sit in the dark long enough that I can figure out what's going on. Instead of turning on my anger, I want to ask my anger what it is doing. Same with anxiety and sadness and all this. So night vision is learning to see in the dark instead of being afraid of the dark. Like I think our society, a lot of people are just afraid of dark moods. They're afraid to go there. They're afraid to talk about it. And so night vision is to learn to see in the dark rather than try to just escape into the light.
Yeah, there's so much there, and there's a lot of beautiful. First of all, beautiful, just yeah, description of something which is so universal and human. I mean, we're not honest with ourselves in the sense that we all have dark days, and there's people who are like honest about that, and then people who just seem, but it's a part of the human nature and human condition. And so it's refreshing to sort of be able to converse about these things honestly. Just to pick up on maybe one of the earlier sort of our starting places here with this light and dark metaphor. So you use the example of Plato's cave metaphor as a way in which this light and dark plays out. I'm reminded of a slightly different context, but again, this the power of language and the power of the light and dark metaphor. There's a chapter in Moby Dick called "The Whiteness of the Whale," which is like a long chapter, like all about light. And in his context, it's more like about wisdom and illumination. But crucially, and so importantly, is that Melville, rhapsodizing poetically about light and this and that, he, of course, makes the connection also to skin color, that Melville himself being white and writing from sort of a racist kind of perspective, says also like the white people, And so in your book, you point out that our language around color also, has a certain racial politics potentially associated with that as well. So that to me is one reminder, just a very blatant, clear example of the way these metaphors and language and light and dark, everyone, skin color is also implicit in that conversation as well.
Yeah, it's like every time we invoke the bright and light, we have to remember that like there exists like skin lightening cream and people put it on their faces, right? Like this isn't a thing of the past. This isn't like, oh, we love all colors. It's like, no, like if white is intelligent and holy and pure and godlike and all the good things. I can't even think of what it's not related to. Um, Beauty, right? There's aesthetic stuff with brightness and lightness. And then that means that darkness, right? And in the very same metaphor, darkness is ugly, darkness is dangerous, darkness is undesirable, darkness is ignorant, unintelligent, right? And that is, in a sense, also coming from Plato's cave, and the whole philosophical movement and the Enlightenment is also wrapped up in there. But it's like we have to be very careful with the words we're choosing. And eventually, like, I don't even want to talk about dark moods anymore. I want to talk about moods. But for now, in this kind of place that we're at, in which we still do describe moods as light and dark, I feel like we have to rethink the dark ones so that we are not just throwing ourselves under the bus when we don't feel well, So yes, so many things are like wrapped into this metaphor. And so I found it quite helpful to like hold on to it when I would sort of get a little bit lost in what I was trying to say. It's like, right, like we need to, the book is so much about language. What do we actually say on a daily basis? How much of what I say actually makes me feel worse? Not even knowing it, or the posters that sometimes people hang in their own house, right? About make today amazing. Like it's like we do it to ourselves sometimes when we buy this stuff. And it's like, oh, you don't realize that maybe that is contributing to why you feel worse when you feel bad. So that's where I want to go, is like we already feel bad. Life already makes us feel bad with all the things that happen to us. But then it's like shame is like feeling bad about feeling bad. So then I feel worse because I'm supposed to be able to change my perspective, change my attitude, be happy, be light, cheer myself up. And so that's what, everyone calls today toxic positivity, right? So it's like, okay, if we live in a world with toxically positive messages, or yeah, toxic positivity messages, then we would do well to get away from them. We would do well to like not put that stuff in our house, and to like not say those things to ourselves, and actually come up with different words that we can say to ourselves and to other people, so that we're not like perpetuating the idea that we should always be happy.
Yeah. I don't know how gendered this is, but as a man, and looking at my male friends and male relationships, I see shame as being so pervasive among especially young men. And the way it plays out, I think, is in meanness, is in like cruelty, you know. When someone, I think, internalized shame sort of spills over into trying, to shame other people and things like that. And it just feels so yeah, pervasive and in the world. And I think that addressing the shame, I think, is so important to healing. And yeah, I think in my own life, my own journey, and just think about the parts of myself that feel unacceptable, unlovable, and healing those, and seeing those, nurturing those to feel less shame, I think, is just so important. Um,
Can I say something about that?
Please, yeah, go ahead.
So I've got two kids, two
Mhm,
boys, and they're 9 and 11, and they play a lot of baseball. And so I've already witnessed this whole like boys don't cry thing.
mhm.
And I think shame for boys especially comes from stifled negative emotions, because you're not supposed to show them, you're not even supposed to feel them, you're weak, right? So it's like a lifetime's worth of stifled, sad emotions that there's no outlet for them, I think does turn into meanness and just shame on, just so many things. I think Brene Brown is really good on this, especially like when she started analyzing like men's shame in particular. It's like, wow, like if if the answer is to shame a kid when they are crying, then what are they going to learn about the world, the hostility to their emotions, and then what are they going to do to each other? And then, oftentimes they grow up to be people who do not, spew their anger. I mean, either, right, spew their anger in mean ways, like you're saying, or just completely, shut down and be unable to like even feel things after a while. And that's what my students report. It's like they're like, I don't have anything to say because I don't even know what I feel. I've lost access to that a long time ago. So I think you're right. And I would love for this book to also sort of like just make society aware that like we've got to start making room for the negative moods, or else there's just going to be more and more and more of this, because we're just still going to be human. There's never going to become a day that we're like, oh, we got over it all and now we're all happy and there's a happily ever after. Like I don't even think that's desirable as a human being, but like certainly it's just never going to happen.
Yeah, yeah. When I was reading or listening to your book, and thinking about someone who might say, take the perspective, we should just eschew the dark, so to speak. Like, why not just why not feel shame, or just feel reject? Why not reject the darkness, which might be the depression or the anxiety? Um, I know. How do you think about that?
So what I'm trying to be very careful about is allowing people who live in these moods to hate the moods. Like a lot of people sort of it's easy to misunderstand the book because there's so many self-help books that are like the 5 gifts of your depression, or like the gifts of your painful moods. I don't need to do that. Like I don't weigh in on like you can hate them, you can love them, you can hate some of them, love some of them. Like the individual gets to do what they want, because I don't want to add more work to the individual. But um, my students, for example, say something like, well, I'm fine, except for that I have depression. And if I could just get rid of the depression, then I'd be a normal person, right? I'm not normal. And so then that leads me to think like, okay, well, if we could just like eradicate the thing itself, especially depression, um, then like, can we just trash one part of it? Can we just trash the mood and keep the self? And my conclusion is you can't. Like, these things are actually like part of us. And people try and try and try, and people write books about how you're not your depression and all this sort of thing. But the problem is that when my students, in attempting to trash that one mood, they actually trash their whole self, because then they're like, I'm broken. I'm a broken human being. And that's what I want to save, is not the mood. I don't need you to love your depression. That's silly. But I mean, some people do, and that's fine too, right? Like, that's okay. If you think of it as a gift, that's fine. But I don't, that's not my line. My line is like, how can we not turn against ourselves? Like, I am the person who lives with the anxiety. And so if I just think the anxiety is a terrible thing and I'm going to throw it out, I'm going to eventually talk badly about myself. And God knows society is talking badly about us, calling us broken and weak and ill and all this kind of like super negative stuff. It just doesn't have anything nice to say, especially about anxious people. It's just that something's wrong with us fundamentally, whether it's chemical in our brain or just irrational, we're just being irrational, you know. So I want to find a way that people cannot turn against themselves. So I'm not trying to redeem the mood. I'm trying to redeem the people. I don't want a person to think that they're less of a human being because they're depressed or because they're grieving than every other single person who walks around this earth who's also sad, who's also grieving, but may not be saying it out loud, may not even know that they're feeling it. I just want to redeem people, not necessarily the mood. So you can go ahead and hate the mood if you want to, although I think some of these moods are actually quite helpful to us, like anger. But it's more about the whole person and keeping the person intact and not turning against ourselves when we start talking about the moods that we are living in.
Yeah. When I was reading or listening to your book, I was reminded of the opening scene of a book that I enjoy, that I love, called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. And in the opening scene of the book, it describes a detective and his wife waking up in bed. And the detective says, it's in the future. It's a dystopic sci-fi future. And he says, he wakes up very happy because he's attached to a device that like gives him happy feelings. And his wife is lying in bed and she's not waking up. That you didn't set your device properly. And she says, don't you dare touch my device. And she says, well, what do you have scheduled for your device today? And she's like I have scheduled like self-loathing and like depression to my device. He's like, I didn't even know you could set your device to that, and there's like, even the imagination of Philip K. Dick's imagination of a dystopic future is one where we plugged ourselves into devices that sort of eliminate all negative feeling. And the wisdom of this character, her name is Iran in the book, that's the name of this Decker's wife in the opening scene of the book, and the book itself, is that her wisdom is that there's beauty in this experience as well. I want to feel everything, and I think and to some extent we all do. I think to some extent we all understand on some level that a superficial society where everyone is happy, or a world where we medicate away all our dark moods, is not a complete experience. It's not a complete life. There's a beauty in the contrast. There's a beauty, within reason. I mean, obviously we can imagine extremes, but within reason, there is a beauty to that, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating book. I've not read it, but I want to. And it's just funny because so many writers and directors and stuff are philosophy majors. And when you find out, when you look into them, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense, because your book is so philosophical, really trying to figure out what would a world be like when we eliminate negative thinking. And I think that's a standard question. Like, for students, would you take a pill if you'd always be happy? And I think that even with medication and with therapy, right, with all our best efforts, it's not going to happen. It hasn't happened. And like you're saying, there are advantages to it not happening. I think the only exception, like in my reading, it was quite humbling because it's depression, right? That's the only one that actually really is so serious. And it, obviously takes lives. And so it's like, if we could eliminate that, I mean, that would be one thing. And then we could just have sadness, and even deep sadness and grief and a lot of things that don't do that, generally speaking. But the point is, there is no pill. And what I like to sort of say about my book, because it's another way that I could be misunderstood. There was a book in like 1987, maybe, called Plato, Not Prozac. It wasn't 87, because Prozac came out in 87. I don't remember when it was. Plato, Not Prozac, right? And that obviously turned on the idea that philosophy can help you. You don't need medicine. And I think that if I could retitle the book, like it would be Plato and Prozac. Like I don't
Hmm.
have a problem with medication. I think that medication, if it works to lower, like using anxiety, to lower the voices in your head that keep you from thinking about what you want to think about and just force you to keep thinking about that anxious thought, or that cycle in your head, that's okay. Like I think that's great. If you can find something like that, and if it works and the side effects are not so great, there's no problem. And but what I would not never want to do for myself, at least, is eliminate anxiety altogether, because anxiety is super helpful. And in the chapter I'm using Kierkegaard, who says that like that anxiety actually makes us human, that it's non-humans. And I'm not even, he does say that the people who aren't anxious are either animals or angels.
Hmm.
And like today we might say, well, there's plenty of anxious animals. Have you met my dog? You know, but specifically like anxiety, he also says that the more profound a civilization, the more anxious the civilization,
Hmm.
because anxiety actually like shows that we're tuned into the world that is suffering. And I wouldn't want to walk around just being completely unaware of all that stuff, or just out of tune, or worse, like callous to that world, like, oh, whatever, that doesn't affect me. So I certainly think there's a great deal of anxiety that is perfectly normal and perfectly within, you know, good levels. And you know, even psychiatrists, psychologists would say that, but they just focus so much on getting rid of it. And like people are very careless with language, like over, like look at all the self-help, overcome your anxiety, get rid of your negative thinking, like demolish it. And it's like, well, that's unrealistic. And for me, most importantly, undesirable, because those things can help us figure out what's really wrong. Like maybe I'm anxious about this little thing that's probably not really going to go wrong, but maybe that's telling me something about my choice of career, or my choice of spouse, or my fear of death, or like a lot of things that are deeper. And if I don't ignore, like if I ignore them and just, you know, go maybe start seeing someone who thinks that that anxiety is just bad and out of place, then I'm never going to get to those deeper things. And so I think the Kierkegaard's advice for us for anxiety is to listen to it, not try to get rid of it, but like let's actually pay attention to it. Once we can get it down to that manageable level where it's not like overtaking our whole life.
Yeah, that was a beautiful section on Kierkegaard, and it was a reading of his that was, I thought, very profound and very, yeah, very nice, very beautiful. In my own, I've spoken on my channel a little bit my own anxiety. You know, I've been transparent, you know, more or less in some ways about the fact that I've often struggled with anxiety for a long time. Um, and I think your book resonated with a lot of the things that have helped me over the years. Another book that helped me, or you know, a speaker, is Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Buddhist meditator, and what he recommends, which is a practice that I try to, you know, internalize, is instead of, you know, deflecting or ignoring, or you know, distracting myself with my phone, which is my go-to if I feel anxious, you know, you look at your anxiety and you say, anxiety, you're like a visitor, you know, what can I do for you? Like, what do you need? You know, and you see it clearly, and you see it how it feels, and you try to embrace it, and you give it love, and you say, you know, again, like, what do you need? What kind of, you talk to it as you might talk to a child, you know, and this is like a visitor that you're hosting, you know, in your body right now. And to me, that was, I think, a very helpful practice, that is certainly an ongoing practice. And I feel your book, to some extent, to a large extent, embraces a similar kind of approach. That this is a part of us. This is something that we're host to, and we should make ourselves good hosts. You know, in a sense. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of overlap between Buddhism and existentialism. And on that point that you're saying, which is that this is a part of us, like we don't have an option. And so our only options is turn against myself and call myself broken because I live with anxiety, or be like, hey, I'm a quirky individual and I have, you know, I'm like deeply attuned to the world, big and small. And some of it is good, some of it is for good. And I can try to figure out what that is. And I wouldn't trade it for being asleep, you know?
Yeah.
So it's the premise isn't that we're inviting it, right? Like we're not inviting suffering. I'm not saying like go seek out, you should be more anxious than you are. I'm saying like however you find yourself, whatever level of anxiety, doesn't make you broken, doesn't make you wrong, doesn't mean there's something like quote unquote wrong with you. It means that something's wrong. And so to analyze, to take the heat off ourselves and to say, okay, what's wrong? To just treat it nicer. And again, it's not necessarily how we talk to ourselves, although we've been talking a lot about that. I want to change society. I want to change the posters that society puts out about how everyone's anxious. Like the best society does is to say we're all in the same boat. A lot of people, 30% of Americans are anxious. It's the number one mental illness of college students. The best society does for us, in my opinion, the way I'm reading the world, is that a lot of people suffer from anxiety, this mental illness that's terrible, and I'm sorry. So I'm like, okay, you just told us we're all in the same boat, but you didn't tell us that we're okay. You didn't tell us that um so much of it is uh you know, I hesitate to use the word normal, but like so much of it is just human. And it just makes us all feel sick. I don't want to feel sick anymore. I want to feel strong. I want to feel like what Glennon Doyle says about anxiety. It means you're paying attention. I want to feel like I'm paying attention. I want to feel like I'm right. So I would like society to just like shift. Let's just pretend like a huge 180 shift and say, let's for the next 20 years pretend or like posit the idea that anxious people are right instead of wrong and ill. What if they're right? What if there's a lot to be anxious about? What if the children, right? Especially the children, everyone's worried about the anxious children. I'm like, what if they're right? What if they're cued in or keyed into a world of suffering and destruction, all available on your phone? Which is funny. That's the thing you go to, right? For like
Hmm. Yeah.
help. And it's like, oh, that's probably a lot of it, right? Like it's just not the phone itself, but the fact that all this stuff is actually happening. Like you're right about a lot of it. And so what if we just started with the opposite premise that we're not necessarily sick? Um, you know, like talking nicer. I don't necessarily only want to talk nicer to ourselves. I want society to talk nicer about us and change the signs and change the posters and change the like strategies of how to help us. I think fewer people would be anxious if we felt like it wasn't this horrible, horrible thing that just makes you a broken person.
Yeah. And I think the listener may have sort of understood this already, but one of the beautiful things about this book is that it's not a self-help book. And there's a political, I think there's a real political agenda in self-help. And one of the things that self-help books do is they put all the responsibility of success on you, and if we've touched on this already. This is not covering, it's not saying anything new, but when you're anxious, of course it's your fault. There's no sense of living in a society where maybe we look out for each other. There's a sense self-help originally is about like making it financially. It's like very capitalistically fueled. It's like pick yourself up by your bootstraps and make money. And there's like it's self-help is like the alternative to like a social safety net. Like if you want to live in a society where we take care of poor people, for example, or mothers who are watching children or something like that, or you can lean into like a self-help culture, and everyone, and you see this on the internet today with like these influencers and encouraging people to get into all sorts of crypto scams and stuff like that. And so the beauty of not buying into that narrative, and saying it's not necessarily you, it's society to some extent. There's an interplay there, and it's not necessarily, we're not only responsible for ourselves, but hopefully we look out for other people, and other people can look out for us, and we should live relationally with people. And I feel like that's what the self-help genre is like almost against.
I could talk for an hour about self-help. I love self-help so much. I'm like, I love reading self-help books. And I've only started sort of analyzing why in writing this book. And it's like everything you said, I just want to like unpack. So self-help is premised on the idea that you are suffering. So like you're suffering already, you're vulnerable. And you go to these people and they make you feel worse. At least they make me feel worse. Because precisely when I'm like, hey, what am I doing wrong? They're like, you're doing this X, Y, and Z wrong. Right. So it's like piles on. Oh, I'm not happy. And you're not happy. I mean, this is a direct quote from one best-selling self-help book. If you're not happy, that's on you. And that comes from the mentality that we choose happy, right? It's the exact same thing, but it's just the underside. If you're happy, it's you. And look, I made myself happy. So these people who write the self-help books, even if they're well-intentioned, and let's just pretend they are, I was in a rough patch. I had this and that ailment and I got over it. I got through it. And so I want to help you and you can get through it too. And so we vulnerable creatures who already feel broken, we go and it's like, yeah, you made this mistake and that mistake. And you know, this is what you can do to get out of the own mess, the mess that you made. And most of them tell us a version of maybe it's not your fault that you got into that mess, but it certainly is your responsibility. And we could go into the philosophy behind that. You know, that's all in the book. But the point is that they continue to make money the more we suffer. So the worse we feel about ourselves, the more the self-help industry actually makes. It's like an $11 billion industry built on the backs of telling us what we're doing wrong and telling us that they know better and telling us how to do it better because they managed, right? So we have to buy into the idea that you can self-help your way to happiness. And precisely what you said, Soraya Chemaly is an author that I use on the chapter on anger. And she said it great. I don't have a direct quote, but she says something like, self-help is what we go to when society just said no. Like society's like, no, we're not going to help you. And so then you're like, I guess I have to help myself. And so I'm really want to reject the idea that each individual, it's your fault that you're unhappy and you need to do X, Y, and Z. So I think of my book as like half self-help, except that it's self-help without the homework. I wanted a kind of self-help, and so far this has been pretty accurate, that makes people say, oh, I just feel seen. I just feel validated. Like I don't, there's nothing else I have to do. I'm not telling you, you know, talk to yourself like this, tell yourself that. It's like, oh no, I'm okay. Like I'm a perfectly human individual who has been made to feel like garbage from a society that thinks our dark moods are actually garbage. So so that's just a lot of it. And I feel like it's once you kind of dig into like, I mean, I still go to self-help. I love like parenting books and everything. And part of it is that masochism of like, yes, you're right. I'm a terrible parent. How could like you help me be better? And so it's not even something that we get out of, but it's something to like go with caution in the same way that in the book I say like go with caution to the Stoics. If you're into Stoicism, it's a very dangerous philosophy that is built on a world that refuses to change. It's actually quite similar to self-help. The premise is that you're stuck in all your situations, whether it's personal or work or societal, nothing will change. You will never get justice. You're basically in a prison cell. And so you're going to have to make lemonade out of lemons. That's all. Like no one is going to help you. The world won't change. And what does that do to us? That makes us think, or like never, we're certainly never going to get together and try to change the world because we're already going to have that idea that the world is terrible or society's harsh and it's sexist, ageist, racist, homophobic, and it's never going to change. And there's nothing we can do to change it. And so how can I make my own individual self happy? And I just think that's going to take forever. And it's not even that I think it doesn't work. I've read lots of self-help books that I like that make me like an inch happier, but it's kind of it's inefficient. Like I feel like if we could actually rebel and like get together and actually try to change the systems that we find so harsh or even oppressive, I have like this weird optimism about the world that we could actually change the world. We don't have to just keep changing ourselves. Like change yourself, change the world. Like I'm like, how about change the world and then I won't need to be changed because I'm okay as I am, that kind of thing. And so it's like there's these genres that kind of pedal on the idea of self-loathing. And if you have that, and if you feel like you're not okay as you are, then you're going to sort of be vulnerable to what they're going to tell you, which is kind of piling on, even as they say things like you're okay and whatever, like they're also saying like if you're not happy, it's on you.
Yeah. And Allison, we've touched on these threads already, but the modern world we live in is for people I think who see clearly and who are honest, is a bit of a mess, to say the least. And we could talk about things in the news and the sort of erosion of democracy and global warming and on, but just the sense in which we're so atomized and so isolated, the erosion of communities, the sense in which everything is so corporatized and commodified, the way in which advertising, and social media and sort of fake, just product placement, influencer stuff we're in such a strange moment in history. And of course that is going to play out into our psychological well-being. And again, the self-help genre is all about ultimately ignoring the ways in which society might be broken. I mean, that to me ultimately seems to be the agenda there. And then, like you're saying, of course, I think a healthier, wiser attitude is to recognize the complexity of all those things, that are at play today.
I think a good example of that is just anger. I mean, if I had to devise a world that was unjust and would never change, I would have as part of the philosophy of that world that feeling anger is wrong, especially for the people who are suffering from that injustice.
Yeah.
So when I think of that anger is an unladylike emotion for women, and that women are not even supposed to feel it, and they're supposed to apologize when they're angry, that's an inheritance that we have all the way from ancient philosophy. I say in the book, like, I just think it needs to change. I think we can get re-educated. And the three thinkers I use are women of color. And I'm like, yeah, I think they have a better description and a better analysis and sort of definition of anger and how we should feel about our anger than just a knee jerk, if I'm angry, I'm wrong. That's how I felt for like 40 years of my life. If I'm angry, I must be wrong because I'm a monster and good girls don't get angry. And so it's like, if that's the setup, then we're certainly never going to blame the society or see the injustice for what it is. We're going to turn it on the inside and be like, oh, something's wrong with me. That's why I want everyone to stop at, like, at least think, kind of play with the idea that maybe just something's wrong. Don't
Yeah.
it automatically make it something's wrong with me, especially in anger. It's so unattractive, it's so crazy, it's so irrational. You're supposed to calm down before you say anything. And I just think, oh my God, if I calm down, I'm going to take it all back. I'm going to say, oh, how silly. I don't know why I overreacted. It's no big deal, no problem, right? I'm going to calm down and I'm not going to get it out. And so, Audre Lorde, Maria Lugones, Bell Hooks, they're like, yeah, maybe don't calm down. Maybe say it when you mean it and say it articulately when you mean it, because anger isn't always inarticulate. It just has a bad rap of being inarticulate. But sometimes it is crystal clear what's wrong when you're angry. And if you calm down or count to 10 or, do any of those practices that are designed to like get rid of it, which is just the standard advice for everybody, children, men, women, just calm down, and then it'll come out better. And it's like, no, I might just forget about it. I might actually lose my fire. And so I think when we think about like these can be tools, like Audre Lorde called anger a tool with which we can excavate honesty. So if we do want to get into the project of changing our society or criticizing, at the very least, let's just be like critical of our society's, what I'm calling nyctophobia, which is fear of the dark, fear of our dark moods. Like, let's at least just listen to our anger and just see like what's really wrong, and maybe we're justified and maybe it's okay, like none of these moods are just sort of good or bad without analyzing them, especially anger. It's not like all anger is good now, but it's like, well, some of them are quite informative and they can really help us. And if we're so busy feeling guilty over even feeling them, then we're never going to get the sense of how they can help us.
Yeah. And one of the beautiful things in your book is the way you talk about different types of anger. And another piece in your book and just in general is it's such a politicized issue. It's weaponized, that there's people who are allowed to be angry in a way, even the moderates, even people on the moderate left who think that, of course, the January 6th protesters were out of line. Of course, it was terrible what they did. There's a sense of empathy we have, as a society collectively in the media for the angry white man, because of course he was wrong, of course he was misled, whatever. But I can empathize with anger, or even Brett Kavanaugh hearing when he got angry, like, you can empathize with the white man who feels aggrieved. But if it's a black man who gets angry, it's a very different response. And you compare, of course, January 6th, like the George Floyd protests and the police response and the society's response. And so there's politics who we allow to express anger. And of course, this, like I think so many things, is largely downstream of politics and power.
It's like what you said at the beginning, which genders, which races are taken up, like which are allowed to feel certain things because of how we take it up, right? Like the point is, if a black man's anger appears as scarier, then we're going to have like a different reaction to it. And so it's like, where did that come from, right? Like going and analyzing and figuring out all that stuff, which is huge, right? I'm just pointing to it in the book, but the whole point is that men are generally allowed to experience anger, but they're not really allowed to cry, you know, and like women are generally not allowed to experience anger, but they're sure as hell able to cry. So then you have all kinds of things that actually like trickle down in society, like the CDC just, you know, this year put out like some findings on adolescent girls are super mentally ill. And it's like, well, okay, you're giving them, a, sorry, I'm going to Spanish here, a fill-in sheet, like an evaluation, right, where they have to write, and it's like kind of understood that like about their feelings, right? So they're supposed to write about their feelings. And then boys are also supposed to write about their feelings. And the findings come out that like girls are sadder than boys. And it's like, well, because the girls are kind of in a society in which they're allowed to talk about their feelings more. And so they were like writing more stuff. And then if the boys just write like, no, I'm fine, it's good, we're going to conclude from that that the boys are just fine, right? So it's like, no, we're not getting good information. We're not getting good data because we're not realizing all of the kind of, yeah, political, but just social aspects of who's allowed to feel what, and certainly who's allowed to express what. And so any kind of measures that we take have to be checked against like who's more likely to write about it, who's more likely to talk about it, whose, you know, anger or sadness has been allowed to exist, who has access to that still. Just like I said with my students, I've had students who are just male students who are like, I just don't feel anything, like something's wrong with me because I don't feel. And it's like, well, if we trace that back, let's go back to when you were 4. Did you feel then? Do you remember having an experience where you did feel and some adult told you that that was wrong, right? So much of even our like evidence or like what we think is the case, we might have to doubt. Like there's another thing about depression. Like we think of depression as like you go to bed and you're just in bed and you have the blinds closed and you don't, I don't know, maybe don't eat or whatever. But like, you know, apparently for men and boys, like depression can come out as anger. Depression can come out as like over like stimulation, like going out and doing like really daring things, kind of playing with death there, right? And so it's like, oh, if we have this idea of what anger or what depression is, then we're not going to measure it correctly because we don't realize that it will play out differently depending on who's allowed to feel what and how they're allowed to express that
Yeah.
thing without getting more penalized by society.
Yeah. And other people have written, I think of like Foucault and just others, like the way in which all our whole mental health apparatus is downstream of capitalism. So if our goal is to make good worker bees who are going to sit in the office all day, the diagnoses that we have are, you know, when does it disrupt your ability to sit in a cubicle and you know, work all day? And so just interrogating even just our whole definition or definitions of what we call, you know, impairment, and the expectations, you know, that we have of, yeah, and just the way in which society is strange and puts on impositions on us. And mental health is the interaction between those two things. It doesn't happen just in isolation. I'm curious if you can talk about grief. You know, how should we grieve? How should we think about grief?
We're on the same page because I was just thinking like nowhere, it's not like the medicalization of grief is the most offensive to people because although we seem to be okay with like, you know, anxiety and depression are mental illnesses. Like when you say like grief is a mental illness, people are like, wait, what? What do you mean? You know, and so people are still quite resistant to it. And, you know, there have been trials for grief medication coming out
Mhm.
since 2010. And so pretty soon it's going to be just up there with the other two as like, here's a problem. And what you were saying is kind of true where, um, you know, like we have a certain standard of if you're grieving over 2 weeks, right? If you have these sorts of symptoms over 2 weeks, and then it's like, well, who did that? How did that happen? That didn't used to be there, right? Things come in and out of the DSM in different years. And so it's like we have to take some of it with a grain of salt. And so grief is just a great example of something where I think our society makes it much worse, right? So you have just grief, like somebody died that you loved. So you're just feeling sad. And then you have like society's bright lights come in and they're trying to cheer you up. And like to put it the most charitably, we like the way that sort of I was raised in a society that has, you know, posters like make yourself happy and choose happy and all this. We're sort of made to believe two things about sadness and which apply to grief in the extreme. One is that my feelings are a burden on other people. So that if I share my sadness with you, I'm bringing you down. And the people will say things like, I don't want you to suffer because I'm suffering. Like, I don't want to put that on you. That's one thing that we have been sort of taught to believe that may not actually be true. The second thing that we've been taught to believe is that we are supposed to cheer each other up. Like a good friend, our role is to make you feel better. And certainly in the realm of grief, there is nothing we can say to make another person feel better. Like, I feel like that's just Megan Devine says that. Megan Devine is like, for me, just the queen of all things grief, because she wrote a book that's called like, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, Grieving in a World That Doesn't Understand. So when people try to make you feel better, especially about grief, either by saying, don't think about that person, or like, what? You're still thinking about them? Or this was God's will. They're in a better place. You know, there's like 1,000 things that we say that really can actually and often make the person feel worse than if you hadn't said anything at all. And so people are always really nervous about, what should I say? How do I make the person feel better? And so if I would love to release us of that burden, like, it's not our job to make other people feel better, because that's not, it's not a thing that we can really do. And oftentimes in our attempts to make people feel better, we just piss them off. We make them really annoyed because it's like either we're rushing them through it. Why are you still crying? That happened 2 weeks ago. That happened a month ago. Oh, you're still thinking about that person. You have to get over it. You have to live your life. So either we're rushing them through it, or in some cases, my students have told me that they get the opposite. Why aren't you crying? Didn't you love your uncle? What's wrong with you? Why aren't you crying? And so society has these like bizarro uh, assumptions about like how to grieve properly. And so for me, I leave it all up to the griever. The griever can grieve however they grieve, and no judgment. And so I'm kind of criticizing the idea that we can say like, oh, you're grieving so well, you're so strong, you're doing such a great job with this. I wouldn't be able to do that. I would be a puddle on the floor. Because there we have the light and the dark again. We have the light is like, you're doing it right because you're going to work and you're washing your dishes and you're answering your phone. And then that means that the pressure's on, because if then I take a week to be in bed and like eat pizza from the box, then I am not grieving correctly. And so I want to like erase us of all that judgment about like how to grieve right and how to grieve wrong, because I just don't think there is. It's absolutely different for every person. And even if two people, I just lost my mother in June, two people lost their mother, it can be completely different. And so I want to take the heat off of the griever to be like, how to grieve well. It's just grief. Like, let's leave people with the pain instead of adding a shame for them to feel like, oh, I'm not doing it right. I have a friend who just insists that she's not grieving right. And it's like, man, is that sad? Like, I want to like push the world away. And in fact, I have a student, this was remarkable to me. I have a student who enrolled in like 6 classes, which is like 2 over how many you should take. And I said, why? And she said, because I'm grieving and people won't leave me alone.
Hmm.
And I said, what do you mean? And she said, they just want me to go out. They want me to have a good time. They won't let me be quiet and grieve and be in my house because everybody's worried about me, right? So much of this comes from love. We don't want to like leave someone in the dark, but instead we're trying to pull them into the light. That's, I think, the mistake is like pulling them into the like, come out dancing with me. You got to get out, etc. So this student is like taking classes in order to be able to grieve in private and under the cover of work. No, I can't go out. I have to work tonight. No, I have so much schoolwork. Isn't that like extreme? Like the things that we'll do to buy ourselves time, because the world will not just let us be as we are and say that we are fine as we are, and just be with us and are willing. The world often is not willing to come into the cave with us because they're freaked out. They don't want to feel sad. They don't want us to feel sad. We just are like very like butterfingers with sad emotions. We're kind of like, oh, I don't know what to do. And the worst thing that happens to grievers, I think, I mean, I don't know if it's worse or just as bad, but like they often, grievers get ghosted
Hmm.
because the person, they could be your best friend, and they're like, I'm so sorry I didn't call you after your mom died for 6 months, but
Hmm.
it made me feel so sad and I didn't know what to say. And I'm
Hmm.
like, oh my God, like poor grievers have it the worst because people decide, or just people are so uncomfortable with it that they will just run away.
Yeah.
And I think, okay, like that's wrong. That's our society, right? That's not on an individual basis. That's like a widespread kind of nyctophobia where we have just got to become more comfortable with our own dark moods and other people's dark moods to know that it's okay. You can go into someone's cave. You're not going to get stuck there. You're not, like we have to be able to pass in and out of our dark moods without feeling like every single one is going to like tank us forever.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I'm reminded of King Claudius's words to Hamlet in the play Hamlet, when Hamlet is grieving for the death of his father, and it's just like an amazing example of the way in which people try to bring other grievers into the light. So if I can just read some of that here, he says, "'Tis sweet and commendable in your nature, Hamlet, to give these mourning duties to your father. But you must know your father lost a father, that father lost his, and the survivor bound in filial obligation for some term to do obsequious sorrow, but to persevere in obstinate condolement is of course of impious stubbornness. 'Tis unmanly grief. It shows a will most incorrect to heaven, a heart unfortified, a mind impatient, an understanding simple and unschooled. For what we know must be and is as common as any, the most vulgar thing to sense, why should we in our peevish opposition take it to heart? Fi, it is a fault to heaven, a fault against the dead, a fault to nature, to reason most absurd, whose common theme is death of fathers." Right? He's saying everyone's father dies. But the deeper point here is the fact that I think in the darkness, the dark moods raises this question of the relational aspect, meeting each other in those dark moods, not trying, like you were saying, not trying to pull someone out of the darkness, but being able to be there for someone and to connect with someone. And if we think that the joy in our lives and the beauty of our lives comes from our relationships with people, then of course this is part of that that journey and that drama and that experience in the way in which we can connect. Not by trying to change someone's mood, by meeting someone and being there for someone in their dark mood.
Like a profound experience. But I love the way you brought up Melville and Philip K. Dick and Hamlet.
Mm-hmm.
It's like so cool how these things just like come into your head and you're like, that reminds me of this book. That's what I want all my students to do. Cicero, kind of like what you just read from Hamlet, Cicero believed that grief is optional. So we actually don't have to grieve. It is something that we choose to do. And his evidence for this was that he once saw on the battlefield, like some army general who had just lost a child, they didn't cry. The lip didn't quiver. And he's like, that's how I know that grief is optional. And it's a bad choice because it's only a one-way road. Like if you grieve, you're never gonna be better and you're basically weak and you don't have to do it. So whoever grieves, you're allowing yourself to grieve. And I just think, wow, that's a really, for me, just poor way to look at grief. And so then I kind of want to combat that philosophy with Unamuno. So Miguel de Unamuno is a Spanish philosopher. And he has these like radical, like completely opposite views on dark moods like sadness. And he calls it dolor because he's, Spanish. And I'm using the word dolor in my chapter on sadness because it encompasses everything from kind of worry to sadness to emotional pain, like feeling alone, that kind of thing. And he thinks that while it's true that bodies connect better in joy, physical bodies like have a great time together in joy, that souls join each other better in sorrow. That we have an ability to meet one another like with our true selves in sorrow more than in joy. And this is his philosophy. And you can sort of ask yourself whether you think he's right, right? I think he's right. Like for me, that experience rings very true because once you get past the veneer of, oh, I'm fine, how are you? I'm fine. Like the people who I've really experienced a sad moment with, it's so profound to me. And I feel like as long as you're willing to hold it and be there, you can like gain a lot. And so he and his wife lost a child. They had like 14 kids and they lost a little boy when he was 6. And he says that we were crushed under the same pestle in the same mortar.
Mm.
And that we grew closer together than we ever could have without that. And so the incorrect conclusion to draw is that we're inviting suffering or that we're like going after suffering so we can have some profound experience with each other. Like that's not necessary. Why? Because life gives it to us. Life just kills people that we love. Like I said, my mom just died, right? Like I don't have to want that to experience the kind of stuff that I'm talking about in my book. Life gives you the pain. You don't have to go looking for it. But when we have the pain, the ability to share it with another person is a gift. And so when I was talking about the thing that I think we've learned from society, which is that my pain is a burden and I'm not supposed to give it to you, and I'm really sorry that I told you this really sad thing that's going on in my life. Unamuno's like, when you share your pain with someone, you are like giving them this huge, beautiful gift because you're giving them the ability to see you for real and to meet you where you are and maybe to bring up their own thing, right? Maybe they're sad. Maybe everyone just is walking around with a veneer. And so, what would happen if we were kind of visibly more tender and like more open to a kind of tender relationship with each other? And that we could hold each other's thing without rushing each other, without saying, like, oh, I don't want to hear that, or you're going to bring me down or something. Like he says, when you're already sad, you kind of have nothing to lose. And so he thinks you get like a sixth sense where you could see other sad people because you're seeing past the veneer. You're just like, the jig is up. Like, I see you for real. I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to kind of like pretend to be happy, but I can see you. And so he gives us this beautiful image that I really love to talk about, which is stringed instruments. So I'll just use guitars because I like the guitar. When two guitars are standing close to each other and you pluck the strings of one of them, the other strings vibrate. And I forget what it's called. It's a musical term. But he thinks that that's the way our hearts actually are supposed to behave. So that if someone near me is suffering and they are talking about it, that my heartstrings are supposed to start vibrating. And like sometimes that happens, but we know it's not always true. And so someone asked him point blank, they're like, hey, Miguel, what happens when like my heart doesn't, resonate with somebody who's sad? And Unamuno says, well, either the person has no heartstrings, which is really sad, or their heartstrings have been frozen. Mm. And that's what I think has happened to a lot of us. I think we've become sort of calloused and we've become like thinking that that's our job is to like toughen up and like don't wear your heart on your sleeve and don't be so easily moved to tears and all this. And I think it would be lovely if our job were to be to soften our heartstrings such that we can allow the pain of others to actually touch us. The people we love, right? Like I don't mean you have to sort of become open to everybody's pain, but the people we love, it often does them no good if we shut out their pain or if we, kind of like reject it and insist that they reject it too in the name of strength or, you know, this grief is optional bit from Cicero. And if we actually can sort of like connect and commune in this beautiful gift and see it for what it is rather than mistake it for something that I'm supposed to fix, right? So many of us believe we're supposed to fix each other. If someone's sad, like I don't want, especially with kids, my God, you have 3 kids, right? Like I don't want to see my kid sad. I'm supposed to make it better for them. And it's like, I had this beautiful experience with my kid that reminded me of Unamuno. It was, my mom was dying. She's living in my house. She's living in my bedroom. I went to kiss my kid goodnight and he's crying over something really trivial. He had 2 parties the next day and he had to choose. So he's crying because he doesn't know what to choose. And my mom's dying, right? So I could have easily been like, you spoiled brat, what's wrong with you? That's not worth crying for. I'll give you something to cry about. Like we like this comparison thing is really, really silly. But I could have compared it and said, your grief is nothing. Your sadness is nothing compared to what I'm going through. But I just like rubbed his back and I said nothing because the point is like, he is going to have to choose. You can't go to both. And you just need to cry right now. And that's okay. Right. And then I started crying because he was crying and I was just sitting in a dark room with him. It was very peaceful in a sense. And then he turned around. He's like, Mommy, why are you crying? And I said, baby, because Ita's dying. Mm. And he just started rubbing my back. Mm-hmm. And it was just perfect. I was like, I love that he didn't wipe away my tears because I've never wiped away my kids' tears, right? Like it's saying like, hurry up already. Like, we don't want to see you this way. He did not wipe away my tears. He just kind of rubbed my back. Like we're just 2 little crying individuals. And like, we're both sad for different things, depending on our ages and like, what's sad at that age. Right. And I didn't have to mock him. There's not like, it's almost like there's like a limitation on sympathy or empathy. Like there's enough for everyone. You can be crying about that and I can be crying about this. Like there doesn't have to be well, you don't have anything to cry about. Can't complain. It's like, why not? Just go for it, So I love Unamuno's picture. I think it does us much more good than the picture that says, A, our pain is a burden on others, and B, it's my job to cheer up my friends, because that just puts a whole lot of pressure on me and makes me want to run away instead of go into their room, sit with them, and like, let's just watch a movie, right? A lot of times people who are sad really aren't that demanding. It's like, let's just eat some pizza. Let's do something very low key. I don't want to go out dancing tonight, you know? So I think that if you're the kind of person who really loves your friends and who has felt like, oh, how do I make this person feel better? Don't, like, that's not, it'll probably make them feel better for you not to try to make them feel better, right? For you to just sort of be with them and try to be present and attune yourself to their mood. You know, again, not by force, but if you want to, like if you love them and if you feel like you want to, you know, take that on.
Yeah, well, what an amazing, beautiful story. And of course, Unamuno was just an incredible character and an incredible philosophy to learn about for the first time through your book. So yeah, really thank you for that. I've never lost a parent, or I haven't experienced grief in the way many people have. But to share my experience with grief is my wife and I, we had a pregnancy loss some years ago, and it was what came out of that is we went to a support group, a pregnancy loss support group. And I was very skeptical because it was a huge, huge time commitment. You had to commit to go, and it meant like getting us to the city at night, leaving kids with babysitters for like hours. It was a huge time commitment, and I was so skeptical about it. And it turned out to just be such a healing experience. And it opened my eyes. It opened my eyes to the power of like a support group, you know, a community of people who are going through pain. And I don't know if you could tell, I'm emotionally, I'm feeling things now as I even say this, but just it opened my eyes. And if, you know, I love that in our society, in my community, in my world, there's like a real deep normalization of therapy. I think it's a beautiful thing. But if there was like a magic wand or insight I could share with people, support groups are so powerful. And because of that resonance that Unamuno describes, that shared pain and that shared, you know, that shared, like you said, pestle of experience, and the way life can, you know, sharing that hurt with other people, and being able to care for other people and give love to other people, and see yourself in other people and receive love from other people who know what you're going through. It's an unbelievable experience, unbelievably, for me personally, healing and transformative and eye-opening, and just it's inspiring, just growth in myself in general. So yeah, really, Unamuno in that sense is, I think, a really powerful and special voice. Yeah.
I just think, like, why do we have to, like, why does it get to that a support group is one of the only honest spaces that there are?
Mhm.
You know, like, that's lovely. Your story is so beautiful. And it's, I think, because it is an honest space, like people are just their whole selves, because again, there's nothing to lose, right? No one in there is going to call them a wuss. No one in there is going to tell them that they're grieving over the wrong thing, or that, oh, the baby wasn't even born yet. What are you talking about? Right? Like, there's so much of that in society. Um, like people would say things to me like after I lost my mom, like my friend lost his dog, and he was like, well, but it's nothing like losing a mom. And I'm like, you don't have to do that. Like, you don't have to make distinctions about which is worse, and like, there's enough to go around. Like, your sadness is your sadness and mine is mine, and like, I'm not judging you. I'm not saying like what's wrong with you, you know? So I just feel like getting on the level with people, like making ourselves emotionally honest, it's super dangerous in the sense of like, with the wrong people in the wrong hands, they might make fun of you or whatever. But like, if you can trust people, and if we become trustworthy people, that we can take in another person that we love's kind of pain and just kind of learn to sit with them and let them feel without trying to fix their feelings or make them feel bad about their feelings or anything like that. I would love society to change on that. And I do feel like in that sense, you know, if I can change the way I treat other people when they're grieving, when they're sad, then maybe, you know, they can also do it. And we can sort of shift our world to just be a little bit more emotionally accepting of just all the emotions. And I think at least we're primed for that in 2023 because of COVID. Like, I think that actually helped. Like, during COVID, when I'd be on these Zoom calls, I'd see everyone like frazzled, the hair down, and like they lost their veneer. And you'd ask like, how you doing? And people would be like, terrible. And I was like, that's the first time. Like, I got such a window into honesty during COVID that I haven't, it's like sort of disappeared since. But during that time, I was like so happy that people were being themselves. And I was like, yeah, you're allowed to, because it's socially acceptable to be sad. But like during a hopeful year, Obama got elected, like you're supposed to be happy, whatever, like then there's no room for it. And so I want to create just like the world of, I guess, a little more balance between equally, you could be happy or sad, you could be grieving and laughing, right? There, we're so complex. And to reduce us to sort of one thing is to do us an injustice. And so it's like that experience that you had, I'm so glad you had it. And I bet there's people who went to support groups and they weren't very good. And maybe they weren't good because people weren't being honest, or it was a kind of show or something else. But I would love for a lot of spaces to just feel that comfortable, that you could, that your whole self was just acceptable, whatever mood you're in, you know?
Yeah. Maybe the final question here. And to some extent, it's the question that maybe the whole conversation has already addressed. But just, inevitably, invariably, someone watching this is going through the darkest of moods. That might be grief or anxiety or depression. What do you say to someone like that? What's the message ultimately to people who are struggling in the darkness at this time?
One, no homework. There's nothing you need to do differently. You're not doing something wrong. You're not sad because you're doing something wrong. There's nothing like quote unquote wrong with you. Even if you want to self-describe as having a mental illness, I'm okay with that too. Like I just want more words. I don't want that to be the only word that we use. So for depression, I have a philosopher called Gloria Ansaldúa who calls it the cuadlique state, right? So she just comes up with this new metaphor and this other way of thinking about depression that doesn't solely rely on the medical model or the idea that we're broken. But I don't think you're doing anything wrong. If you're sad or grieving or anxious or whatever, I think the world is super messed up. And I also think we're just tender. Like so many of these things are just evidence that we loved. If we never grieved, it means we were never close enough. So I think of human beings as like, I'm an existentialist. And what that means for me is life is hard. We're sad a lot of the time. I think of human beings as like people who like hold your hair while you're throwing up and hold your hand while you die, right? This is like real life. And when I wrote the book, I hadn't even experienced losing my parents and seeing my mom's final days and all of the real care that goes into that. So all the more so, I'm like, oh my God, like we're so fragile, and not in the sense of I could be broken, but like we are tender human beings, and that's a good thing. Like I think people who think they're the most messed up are the people who live with more than one of these. If they say, well, I have anxiety and depression and this and that, right? And they're like, I'm so messed up. I'm a hot mess, this and that. And I just think you are like the tenderest of us, and life is quite difficult for people like that in our society because of our society, in large part, because our society makes you feel worse about it. And so one is just no homework. Two is it's not you, it's them, right? This idea that like, if you feel terrible about yourself, if you feel more than just the pain of those things, if it's just the pain of those things, there's just nothing I can say to make you feel better because those things are painful. But if it's more than that, if it's this feeling of shame that we were talking about, or feeling bad about feeling bad, then that I think is society's doing. I don't think it's necessary. I think we can change that. I think we can raise our kids differently to not have to feel bad about feeling bad. That's the last thing we need, is to shame kids who are already feeling in pain, or else they just won't talk about their pain, or they'll take it out on other people, etc. So I think your decision as the individual is whether to share your pain. And like I've had readers who are like, I took your advice and I went and I told everyone my pain and it really backfired because nobody was there for me. And I was like, well, that wasn't really my advice. Like in our current world, you have to be careful. And I wrote an essay called Against Cheerfulness. And it was trying to talk about like how we have the right not to be cheerful, and like how being forcibly cheerful is kind of dishonest. And sometimes we do that because we don't trust people around us. Like I don't trust you can hold my feelings. So I'm just going to tell you I'm fine. And you all have people like that in your life. But is there anyone in your life who you feel like you could trust, right? So I wouldn't recommend just telling everyone how you feel and just be like, well, you know, Mariana Alessandri told me to tell everyone my feelings. But it's like, is there anyone out there that you think your relationship could actually grow if you were honest with them? That sort of emotional intimacy with another person, I think, could do a lot of good. Although, again, it's like I hesitate to put any work on the person who's suffering because it's your choice. You don't have to. And it's your right to grieve in private. But can I tell you one more little story from the book?
Please.
It was from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who, was that the stages of grief person. And she said she was talking to a couple who was on the phone with their daughter, and the daughter had just lost her husband. So the daughter's in deep grief, and the parents are talking to her on the phone. The daughter starts crying, and the mother said, "Oh, I'm gonna get off now," because she's kind of like that attitude of, "I'll leave you to cry by yourself. Like, it's private. I don't want you to make a fool of yourself, like, etc." And the dad says, um, I'm not hanging up. I'm gonna stay right here and you cry as much as you want to." And I just find that absolutely gorgeous in its simplicity. It doesn't take much, right? It doesn't take a lot of like fine words to say. We don't have to be geniuses. It's just to say, I can hold you. I'm not only gonna talk to you when you're happy. Like, there's people who tell their kids, like, go into your room and only come out when you're happy. And I think, well, what is that teaching kids, right? Like, I accept your whole self. Today you're happy, today you're sad. Like, there's no limit on like, you have to be this way for me to be your friend or for me to love you. And I think that's the way we should be. And so if you're friends, if you're suffering and your friends are not like that, it's not you, it's them, right? Like, it's like they have been conditioned by a world that thinks that talking about feelings is wrong and being vulnerable is wrong and you're not an alpha or whatever, right? Like, so many toxic masculinity things in our society, and just, you know, there's a million things that are wrong. But I think the thing that's least wrong is us human beings. We're just being human. We're just suffering. We're just feeling good, feeling bad. We're feeling a lot. And I think the more honest we can be, the better. But you have to be careful about who you are going to let into that world, because in many ways the world isn't ready for it, but there's only one way to make the world ready, which is to kind of go for it. And like, let's all kind of go for it together. That's what I think.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And that's I think it's a very beautiful message. And for myself and people who are not in the dark place, it's I think the message is also to be there and to be someone who can hold someone else's um wherever they're at, and be able to meet people where they're at, and be able to yeah, be the person who stays on the phone, you know.
If you love them, right?
Yeah.
It's not extra work. It's people who you already think that you're kind of helping by getting off the phone. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not a mandate. It's just that we tend to want to help our loved ones. We just don't know how. And we tend to do it wrong, or like sometimes do it wrong.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Alessandri, thank you so much. This was really, really I think one of the more emotionally rich and beautiful conversations I've ever had. So yeah, really, really grateful. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for just letting me come on and talking to me about my book and telling me about all these things I wrote down that I have to go read now.